Hey guys, tonight we wander into gardens that smell faintly of thyme, mugwort, and maybe just a hint of paranoia. You're crouched in the mud beside a small patch of green, your fingers brushing the leaves, when suddenly a neighbor peeks through the fence with narrowed eyes. You probably won't survive this whole medieval suspicion game unscathed, but, honestly, nobody ever did. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments, it helps me imagine you squinting at your screen in real time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the damp soil of your tiny garden, knowing full well that in the Middle Ages, even a harmless patch of herbs could get you labeled a witch. Imagine planting sage or rue and realizing your neighbors whisper whenever you step outside. Historians still argue whether these plant-based suspicions were entirely superstition or a community's way of policing resources, because herbs were more than decoration, they were medicine, seasoning, and occasionally, poisons. You tuck a sprig of lavender behind your ear, hoping it doesn't look like a ritualistic charm. Your grandmother might have taught you that thyme wards off spirits. And maybe it does, but if anyone saw you rubbing it into a bundle at dusk, whispers would spread like wildfire. Fringe folklore suggests some villagers believed that certain plants, especially belladonna or mandrake, could transform you into an owl or give you the ability to curse livestock. You chuckle quietly because, well, you're not a wizard. But in that damp garden air, your laughter feels like it's echoing dangerously close to confession. People often forget that medieval gardens were more than aesthetic, they were evidence. Healers and wise women cultivated herbs for tea, poultices, and ointments, yet anyone whose fingers lingered too long over nightshade might find themselves questioned at the local court. Your neighbor's gaze lingers, you adjust your scarf and pretend to prune the rosemary. There's a rhythm to this suspicion, a silent choreography that everyone knows. Plant the wrong thing, appear too knowledgeable, and suddenly your mundane hobby becomes proof of malevolent intent. Even seemingly innocent knowledge could spark accusations. Imagine walking to the well with a bundle of lavender tucked under your arm. And someone mutters that you smell too clean, hinting that perhaps you've charmed the water itself. Historians still argue whether these accusations were fueled more by envy, fear, or genuine belief in witchcraft. Fringe tales say that planting four-leafed clover in a neighbor's yard could bring them illness, or, alternatively, make them fall in love with the next traveling merchant. You pause, imagining that odd superstition in your own hands. The sensory details are subtle but insistent, the damp scent of soil, the crisp bite of morning air, the rustle of leaves that might, or might not, carry magical intent. You kneel, brushing soil from your palms, acutely aware that your very movements could be misinterpreted. You recall stories of herbalists being accused simply because someone had a bad harvest and needed a scapegoat. It's unsettling how ordinary gestures, pressing mint into a tincture, scattering thyme for seasoning, could be construed as summoning spells, and yes, there's humor tucked into the dark corners of this paranoia. A particularly quirky tale tells of a woman accused because she'd planted a witch's garden entirely composed of marigolds, flowers so innocuous that anyone today would call it cheerful landscaping. But in 1487, that careful arrangement might be read as an incantation against the local lord's crops. You smirk, brushing off a leaf, realizing that absurdity often walked hand in hand with terror. Historians still argue whether these accusations were entirely top-down from authorities or more a social mechanism for communities to explain misfortune. Your fingers graze belladonna, and you can almost feel the weight of centuries of belief pressing down on you. Neighbors might whisper, children might point, and you'd have no recourse beyond nervously offering a smile or retreating into your small home. Fringe lore claims that some herbs, like henbane, could induce visions of spirits. But sometimes just got you dizzy, which you can't help but think is a mercifully mundane outcome. You inhale deeply, savoring the sharp, earthy smell of the soil, knowing it's both life and potential accusation in one. Even mundane gardening knowledge could be suspect. For instance, knowing that rosemary preserved food or thyme cleansed wounds was practical, but if you shared this too freely, whispers of sorcery might follow. You recall that your own hands are both tools of life and potential evidence of wrongdoing. Historians still argue whether the botanical expertise of these women, or men, was more a threat to local hierarchies or simply misread by fearful eyes, so as you continue tending to your small patch of green. Remember, every touch, every inhaled scent, every carefully chosen plant could be a silent accusation. Even now, you feel the playful tension in the air, the invisible gaze of generations imagining you as a conduit of unseen forces. It's oddly intimate, this brush with historical fear, a sensation mingling awe, amusement, and mild panic. And maybe, just maybe, that's why these stories endure, because they make you hyper-aware of how ordinary life could be perceived as extraordinary, and sometimes deadly. You step inside your dimly lit cottage, still smelling faintly of damp soil and crushed herbs, and notice the small bundles of dried flowers hanging from the rafters. They sway slightly, catching the flickering candlelight, and for a moment you feel like the shadows themselves are judging you. In the Middle Ages, those who treated wounds or brewed teas were walking a narrow line between healer and heretic, and today, you might be considered just an eccentric gardener, but back then, one sneeze in the wrong room, and your healing hands could be a ticket to the local court. Historians still argue whether witch trials primarily targeted women because of their societal roles or simply because fear thrives on the vulnerable. You kneel to adjust a jar of dried chamomile, recalling the times when wise women were called upon to cure fevers, stitch wounds, or help with childbirth. On the surface, it's practical, nurturing work, yet it often came with a shadow. Even an accidental death, a child who succumbed to illness despite your best efforts, could spiral into rumors of foul play. Fringe stories insist that some healers were accused of feeding illness to patients with a malicious wink, though most likely, it was just a tragic coincidence magnified by fear and gossip. The air smells faintly of rosemary and vinegar, a combination both comforting and sharp, much like the community's perception of you. You remember reading about women who carried pouches of herbs, ostensibly for remedies, but neighbors insisted these were witches' charms. Some herbs, like rue, were thought to ward off evil, while others, like foxglove, could induce hallucinations or even death if misused. And so your knowledge, once a badge of skill, becomes a point of scrutiny. Historians still argue whether the accusations of healing-induced witchcraft were rooted in misogyny, superstition, or simply misunderstanding of herbal science. You reach for a small vial of tincture, shaking it gently. There's a peculiar intimacy in mixing herbs into potions, watching the liquid swirl and change color. Yet, medieval townsfolk might have interpreted this very act as evidence of dark dealings. Fringe tales tell of herbalists who were accused merely for having the audacity to experiment with new mixtures, one neighbor's burnt stew, one failed poultice, and suddenly the healer was casting spells. You can't help but smirk at how mundane trial and error could be twisted into sinister intent. As you arrange your jars, you notice the patterns in the dried herbs. Lavender, sage, chamomile, they're arranged meticulously, but to anyone passing by, it could look like a deliberate ritual. Historians still argue whether these visual cues, careful bundles, hanging flowers, and curious patterns, were actually magical practices or simply efficient storage techniques misinterpreted through fear. You run your fingers over a string of dried mugwort, inhaling its pungent, camphor-like scent, and feel a thrill of defiance. Here you are, simply a caretaker of plants, yet centuries ago, this act alone could draw suspicion. You pause and reflect on the sensory side of healing. Grinding herbs, feeling the texture of crushed leaves between your fingers, smelling pungent aromas filling the room, all of it is so tactile, so human. Yet that same intimacy was part of the danger. A child's sudden recovery might be celebrated, but a neighbor's misfortune could retroactively brand you a witch. Fringe accounts even mention healers who whispered spells or charms to comfort patients, which were later misconstrued as invoking evil spirits. You can't decide whether it's terrifying or hilariously unjust. And then there's the social element. The healer's reputation was precarious, resting on a delicate balance of skill, goodwill, and luck. One misinterpreted gesture, handing someone a poultice too enthusiastically, murmuring a reassuring word too softly, could turn admiration into suspicion. Historians still argue whether communities genuinely believed in the malevolent intent of these healers, or whether the accusations were more about controlling knowledge and maintaining societal hierarchies. You glance at your hands again, imagining the past where these same movements, stroking a patient's forehead, crushing leaves for a remedy, whispering encouragement, were scrutinized. A small, almost imperceptible twitch of the fingers could be labeled a spellcasting motion. Fringe folklore even suggests that healers were sometimes blamed for breathing illnesses into patients, an idea that seems absurd now but reflects how fear can warp perception. The dim light accentuates the textures of your workspace, cracked wooden shelves, jars lined with powders, and a faint wisp of smoke curling from a still-burning candle. Despite all this, there's a rhythm to being a healer that you can't ignore. Grinding herbs, boiling roots, and whispering gentle encouragements are all acts of care and observation. The irony, of course, is that these very acts, so intimate, so skillful, made you vulnerable to accusations. And sometimes, humor pokes through the darkness. Medieval trial records mention women accused for curing neighbors too well, because clearly, recovery that quick must be magic. Historians still argue whether these ironic accusations were widespread or merely the dramatic exceptions that survived in written records. You finish organizing the chamomile and sage, breathing in the mixture of scents, earthy, bitter, faintly sweet. You imagine the countless healers of the past, hands just like yours, moving cautiously through rooms filled with patients, family, and the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors. Each tincture, each poultice, is a story of care, fear, and sometimes, unjust suspicion. And as you settle back on the wooden chair, feeling the gentle sway of the hanging herbs, you realize that even the simplest act of helping someone, tending to their fever, mending their wound, could have been seen as a dangerous magic in the wrong eyes. You step outside again, and the courtyard is bathed in a pale, silver light. A black cat weaves between your legs, tail flicking, eyes glinting like tiny lanterns in the twilight. In the Middle Ages, that feline companion could transform you from a harmless gardener or healer into a suspect in a witchcraft case. People whispered that black cats were familiars, loyal helpers of witches, carrying messages to the devil himself. Historians still argue whether these associations were born purely of superstition, or whether they were influenced by practical fears of predation on poultry and small livestock. The cat circles your ankles, purring, and you can't help but grin. Fringe legends insist that a black cat could also absorb your misfortune, leaving you lucky, or so unlucky neighbors claimed. Owning such a creature was a double-edged sword, comforting and warm, yet potentially incriminating. You bend down, scratching behind its ears, and imagine the medieval villagers peering through windows, frowning at your feline friend and wondering what sinister magic you were secretly practicing. It wasn't just cats. Any pet, really, could spark suspicion. A fat, lazy dog sleeping by the fire might be seen as a shape-shifted demon, while chickens wandering too close to the neighbor's garden could be proof of ill intent. You watch your black cat curl into a tight circle on the doorstep, thinking about how absurd it would be to go to court defending the innocence of an animal. Yet, such cases existed. Fringe stories tell of trials where cats were sentenced alongside their owners, dragged to churchyards, and ceremonially cleansed or worse. You wander toward the herb patch again, hearing the soft thud of paws on the earth. The scent of lavender and mint mixes with the cool evening air. Owning a cat was not just about companionship, it was a statement, intentional or not. If your neighbors were wary of witches, then any nocturnal prowler, feline or human, could become part of a narrative of devilry. Historians still argue whether accusations against people with pets were symbolic, social, or genuinely feared as supernatural conspiracies. The black cat suddenly darts into a shadow, and your heart skips. Fringe superstition claimed that a cat appearing suddenly in your path could be a warning of misfortune, or a sign that you were already under scrutiny. You chuckle softly, imagining yourself explaining to a medieval inquisitor that, yes, it's just a cat, and no, it's not casting spells on your neighbor's cow. The absurdity hangs in the air, yet the tension is real. To the superstitious, every twitch, purr, or hiss could carry meaning. You notice the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze and think about how sensory details amplified fear. A sudden meow, a shadow passing over the wall, or even the glint of a cat's eyes in the moonlight could be enough to convince villagers that magic was afoot. Fringe tales report that some people believed cats could steal breaths or whisper secrets to the devil, making you reconsider just how innocent your little companion really is. Even clothing mattered. A neighbor wearing black might blend with their cat, inviting suspicion. A colorful scarf could be construed as a charm. You tug your own cloak tighter, aware that in medieval eyes, perception mattered as much as reality. Historians still argue whether witchcraft accusations based on animal ownership were more about gender, social control, or genuine fear of the supernatural. You crouch by your herb garden, stroking the cat's sleek fur, reflecting on how these suspicions intersected with everyday life. People would whisper if your cat sat on your windowsill, if it followed you to the well, or if it lingered near a neighbor's property. Even innocuous actions could be magnified into damning evidence. Fringe folklore suggests that cats sometimes borrowed powers from their owners, making a healer's black cat appear twice as threatening. You laugh quietly because, yes, your cat might be more theatrical than magical, but the villagers couldn't know that, and humor did exist in these fears, though often bitter. One story recounts a woman accused of witchcraft simply because her black cat repeatedly knocked over a basket of apples, which were then blamed on curses rather than clumsiness. The absurdity of equating fruit on the ground with dark magic highlights the precariousness of social perception. Historians still argue whether such cases were exceptional anecdotes or representative of common paranoia. The sensory tapestry continues, the night air, rich with lavender and the faint hint of earth, the warmth of your cat's body against your palm, the flicker of candlelight spilling from windows. Each detail underscores how everyday life could be interpreted as evidence. You feel the gentle weight of history pressing lightly on your shoulders, a reminder that even affection for a simple creature could carry consequences. And somehow, this tension, between domestic comfort and communal suspicion, feels timeless. The morning light slants through your window, highlighting a faint, irregular mark on your wrist that you've barely noticed until now. In the Middle Ages, a birthmark, or any unusual mark on the skin, could be read as evidence of a pact with dark forces. Your mark is harmless, just a smudge of pigmentation, but villagers might see it as a witch's teat, a mystical sign allegedly used to feed demons. Historians still argue whether these readings of the human body were rooted in genuine belief, ignorance of anatomy, or an excuse to persecute outsiders. You trace the outline of the mark with your finger, feeling an odd mix of curiosity and unease. Fringe lore claims some marks were placed by the devil himself. Invisible to the innocent but glowing faintly at midnight, visible only to those attuned to the supernatural. You roll your eyes, imagining yourself sitting under a full moon, suddenly glowing like a medieval neon sign for evil intent. It's ridiculous, but for someone living in the 15th century, the line between ordinary and ominous was perilously thin. Your mind drifts to neighbors' whispers and curious stares. A birthmark, a scar, or even a patch of unusually pale skin could be interpreted as a sign of connection to forbidden powers. You dab a bit of chamomile tea on the mark, soothing the skin, yet wondering if such a mundane action might have been misread. Fringe accounts suggest that women with such marks were sometimes forced to undergo tests to prove their innocence. Bizarre trials involving water, pricking, or observing reactions to pain, which historians still debate regarding accuracy and frequency. You step outside, the morning dew cool underfoot, and notice a patch of sunlight illuminating your arm. Your birthmark seems insignificant in this soft glow, just another quirk of human skin. Yet in a society hyper-attuned to signs, any deviation from normalcy could spark suspicion. People believed that the devil might mark his chosen servants, leaving subtle physical reminders that only the observant, or paranoid, could detect. Fringe tales even claimed that some marked individuals were said to be able to summon storms or influence crops through mere touch. You laugh quietly at the thought, your mark doesn't even summon a breeze. The social implications of these marks were profound. Imagine the tension in a crowded market, a sudden glance at your wrist, a whisper shared between neighbors, and suddenly, your identity shifts from ordinary villager to potential witch. Historians still argue whether these markings were a convenient scapegoat for unexplained misfortune or a reflection of deeper anxieties about the body. Disease and morality. You flex your fingers and notice small scars on your knuckles, each telling a story of childhood scrapes and kitchen accidents. In a medieval lens, even these minor imperfections could become symbols of hidden knowledge or dark power. Fringe legends suggest that the size, shape, and color of a mark could dictate the type of magic the bearer was capable of, white marks for protective spells, red for curses, dark for demonic affiliations. You shake your head, amused at the arbitrary classifications, yet can't deny the oppressive weight of such interpretations in historical context. Even mundane acts of curiosity, examining your skin in sunlight, noting a mole, or pointing it out to a friend, might have been deemed suspicious. You imagine someone centuries ago, performing the same actions under the watchful eyes of their community, and shiver at the social tightrope they had to walk. Fringe accounts describe women secretly marking themselves to ward off evil, which could backfire, leading to accusations of collusion with dark forces. Historians still argue whether these self-protective measures were common or simply rare anecdotes preserved in records. You take a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill your lungs, and feel the small thrill of defiance. Your body is your own, not a ledger of suspicion. The sensory details of this scene, the sun on your skin, the cool breeze, the faint aroma of herbs nearby, remind you that life moves forward, even when superstition tries to freeze it in fear. You recall the black cat slinking through the courtyard yesterday, and you can't help but connect the dots: companions, herbs, marks, all ordinary, yet all potentially incriminating. Humor eases some tension. Imagine a villager accusing a baker's apprentice of witchcraft for having freckles on their nose, claiming each freckle was a devil's fingerprint. You grin, knowing that history is littered with these absurd, yet tragic, examples. And as you flex your fingers again, tracing the subtle birthmark on your wrist, you realize that survival required not just skill and luck, but an acute awareness of how every detail of your body and actions could be misread. Night falls, soft and heavy, and you find yourself wandering the garden under a silvered moon, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves. You hum quietly, almost unconsciously, a tune that feels familiar, while the shadows stretch long across the courtyard. In the Middle Ages, even something as innocent as speaking to the night sky or praying at odd hours could earn a wary glance, or a formal accusation. People believed that whispering to the moon, or talking when no one else was around, might invite spirits or demons. Historians still argue whether nocturnal devotion was truly feared or whether these acts were twisted into evidence only after misfortune struck. You pause, inhaling the sharp fragrance of mint, and notice the faint glimmer of dew on the leaves. Fringe folklore claims that praying at midnight could open doors to other realms, allowing you to see, or even converse with, entities no mortal should encounter. You chuckle softly, imagining yourself in full ritual attire, whispering secrets to the stars, and being watched by a cluster of suspicious neighbors hiding behind hedges. The absurdity is almost comforting, at least the imagined danger is distant. The cool breeze brushes across your skin, and the garden hums with nocturnal life, insects chirping, leaves rustling, the soft padding of your black cat. This sensory immersion, so ordinary now, would have seemed charged with significance in the 15th century. Even muttering a simple wish for good harvest or a sick neighbor's recovery could be seen as invoking forbidden powers. Fringe accounts suggest that those who prayed or spoke under moonlight sometimes left offerings, crumbs, water, herbs, which could be interpreted as magical rituals. Historians still debate whether these were widely practiced acts of folk religion or convenient fabrications by accusers. You tread lightly among the herbs, mindful of shadows and shapes. Lavender leans toward your fingertips, thyme brushes against your palm, and you feel the tiny prick of fear mingled with fascination. Talking alone at night could be read as a sign of clandestine knowledge, a way of communicating with unseen forces. And yet, in reality, it was just quiet reflection, a break from the bustle of daily labor. Fringe stories tell of people being accused simply for walking barefoot in the moonlight, leaving mysterious footprints in gardens or fields, and later claiming these were marks of witchcraft. As your gaze follows the cat weaving between the moonlit plants, you notice how ordinary sounds might be misinterpreted. The snap of a twig, the flapping of wings, even your own sigh could be considered supernatural signals. Historians still argue whether these observations were genuinely believed by medieval communities, or whether they were post facto justifications for scapegoating individuals already under social suspicion. You bend down, brushing fingers across chamomile and sage, noting their faint, calming aroma. The act of tending herbs at night, whispering their names as part of a simple ritual for remembrance or care, could have been twisted into evidence of nocturnal magic. Fringe accounts describe villagers discovering midnight circles of herbs and interpreting them as secret covens, when in fact, it might have just been someone practicing a folk remedy in solitude. You smile wryly at the thought of someone being interrogated for having the temerity to enjoy the quiet of the night. The tactile sensations of the garden, the rough bark under your fingertips, the damp soil, the soft fur of the cat weaving around your ankles, contrast sharply with the imagined social peril. In an era attuned to omens, every sensory detail could be amplified into a portent. You remember previous sections, herbs that marked you as a healer, a black cat's companionship, a birthmark that signaled hidden deals, and now your midnight musings, all ordinary, yet all potentially suspicious. A sudden rustle startles you, and you pause, heart ticking faster. Fringe folklore insists that spirits often visited at night to whisper secrets or warnings, and that only those practicing dark arts could perceive them. You chuckle softly, shaking your head. In truth, it's probably just the cat chasing a moth. Historians still argue whether tales of nocturnal witchcraft were largely fabricated to maintain social control or whether communities genuinely feared these nightly phenomena. Humor seeps in again. Imagine someone being accused of incantation simply because they whispered to the stars to remember a loved one, or because their cat meowed in response. The irony is thick, private reflection misread as a public threat. You inhale the cool, herb-scented air, feeling the garden around you alive but ordinary, and sense the delicate tension between normal human behavior and the medieval interpretation of magic. As you wander back toward the house, the moonlight brushing your face, you realize that much of life in that period was a careful dance with perception. Every shadow, sound, or murmur could be a story to someone else, sometimes turning devotion, curiosity, or care into suspicion. And in that quiet night, with the hum of insects and the soft breathing of your feline companion, you appreciate the odd intimacy of this historical lens. It teaches vigilance, empathy, and a wry sense of humor all at once. You stand over your little cauldron, the faint haze of steam curling upward, carrying scents of rosemary, lavender, and something sharper you can't quite place, maybe thyme or just the faint tang of vinegar. In the Middle Ages, mixing herbs in water could be entirely practical, a tincture for headaches, a tea for digestion. But to an observer with a suspicious eye, it could be construed as brewing spells. Herbal potions were both lifelines and potential death warrants, depending entirely on who was watching. Historians still argue whether accusations around these mixtures were genuinely about superstition, or more about controlling women's knowledge and mobility in society. You dip your finger in the bubbling concoction. Careful not to burn yourself, and you can't help but think of the dual nature of herbs. Chamomile soothes, belladonna can kill, and rue promises protection but is pungent enough to offend neighbors. Fringe legends insist that a skilled potion maker could create love or vengeance in a single draft, and a misstep could inadvertently summon spirits. You chuckle at the idea. Your morning headache relief might have been considered evidence of a secretive alliance with the underworld. The sensory richness of potion making is immediate: steam that stings your nostrils, the warmth of the bowl through your palms, the soft plink of a dropped twig in water. Each motion, stirring clockwise or counterclockwise, measuring leaves, adding drops of oil, is mundane yet could be read as deliberate incantation. Some medieval observers claimed that stirring in a particular pattern could summon curses, though historians still argue whether these interpretations were common or exceptional embellishments by court recorders. You stir slowly, imagining your ancestors performing similar rituals in kitchens and backyards. Fringe accounts describe potion making as a near-theatrical craft, with carefully arranged ingredients and whispered formulas, yet in most cases, it was simply practical science dressed in local superstition. One tiny mistake, a teaspoon too much or too little, could result in a failed remedy or, to the watchful neighbor, evidence of sorcery. You smirk, remembering that the same mixture you just brewed could have healed someone or condemned them, depending entirely on perception. Even the act of sharing your remedies could be perilous. Offering tea for a cough might be taken as manipulation of fate. A friend's sudden recovery could be praised, or feared. Fringe stories claim that some potion makers were accused for curing illnesses too effectively, prompting accusations that they interfered with God's will. Historians still argue whether these accusations reflected actual magical beliefs or a method of regulating communal power and reputation. You add a sprig of sage and inhale its earthy, camphor-like aroma. The sensory layer is intoxicating: herbs crushed in your fingers, liquid swirling in warm air, the faint hiss as a leaf touches hot water. But each movement could be misinterpreted in a medieval context. You imagine a neighbor peering through a fence, eyes narrowed, imagining sinister intent in your careful motions. Fringe folklore says that some potion makers hid small tokens, stones, feathers, tiny charms, inside mixtures to ward off evil, which could inadvertently be seen as evidence of spells. The practical nature of your actions contrasts with the fear they might inspire. You measure, pour, and stir, following instinct and tradition rather than dark designs. Yet the medieval imagination was vivid and hungry for meaning. Every clink of a spoon, every aromatic puff could become part of a story about witchcraft. Historians still argue whether these fears were socially contagious, a product of rumor and rumor alone, or whether some communities genuinely believed in the efficacy of magical potions. Humor surfaces again in your musings. Imagine a potion accidentally made too strong, turning a mild headache into a rather uncomfortable dizziness, and the neighbors calling the local magistrate, convinced a curse had been unleashed. You snicker at the thought, appreciating the absurdity embedded in a society constantly trying to reconcile natural events with supernatural explanation. The tactile engagement continues: soft leaves crushed between your fingers, warm liquid circulating in your bowl, steam brushing your cheeks. Each sense anchors you in reality, yet it also reminds you how every ordinary act could be sensationalized. You pause to breathe deeply, savoring the fragrance and warmth, and reflect that knowledge, skill, and care were as dangerous as they were useful. As the concoction simmers, you realize that your movements, so ordinary, so human, bridge the gap between science and superstition. Each potion is a microcosm of medieval life, an intersection of observation, tradition, and fear. And as you watch the steam rise and curl toward the ceiling, you feel the strange thrill of knowing that something as simple as boiling herbs could have been a lifeline, a comfort, or a condemnation, depending entirely on eyes that were watching, waiting, and interpreting. The morning sun warms your back as you step into the courtyard, and you notice the silver strands threading through your hair, catching the light. In the Middle Ages, age itself was a magnet for suspicion. Elderly women, especially those who had survived decades of illness, childbirth, and hard labor, were often prime targets for witchcraft accusations. Their experience, wisdom, and independence seemed threatening in a world that prized obedience and conformity. Historians still argue whether this targeting was rooted more in fear of female autonomy or in simple envy of survival and knowledge. You brush your fingers over the rough wood of a fence post, thinking about the countless older women who quietly managed households, raised families, and tended gardens, only to be whispered about when misfortune struck. Fringe stories suggest that the elderly could harness special powers through the accumulated wisdom of their years, making them both revered and feared. You grin slightly at the irony. Surviving long enough to enjoy life could also make you a suspect. The courtyard smells of wet earth and dried herbs, and the tactile sensation of rough stone beneath your fingertips grounds you. You notice a group of younger villagers passing by, glancing curiously at your figure. It's subtle, but in that glance lies judgment. A woman's age could be equated with experience in both life and magic, a harmless gesture, like handing over a healing tea, could be interpreted as casting spells. Historians still argue whether such perceptions were genuine fear or a convenient excuse to marginalize older women in the social hierarchy. You pause by the herb patch, running your fingers through the soft leaves of sage and thyme. The knowledge accumulated over decades, how to blend herbs, when to harvest, which remedies worked, was precisely what could arouse suspicion. Fringe lore even suggested that older women could shape-shift into animals or converse with spirits, simply by virtue of having lived long enough to gain hidden insight. You chuckle softly at the absurdity, but also feel the palpable tension that history preserves in its records. Even ordinary routines could be perilous. Walking at dusk, tending a garden, or offering advice to neighbors were all actions loaded with potential misinterpretation. Sensory details. Sunlight glinting off silver hair, the rustle of a cloak, the aroma of drying herbs, could mark you as conspicuous, a subtle but undeniable presence. Fringe tales report that some elderly women were accused merely for knitting or spinning quietly, because their hands were too skilled or capable of weaving spells into fabric. Historians still debate how widespread these accusations were versus how much they reflect selective court documentation. You sit on a low bench, feeling the rough texture beneath your palms, and reflect on how social dynamics intersected with age. Wisdom, once a respected asset, could become a liability. Communities might fear that an older woman's knowledge of remedies, plants, and local lore gave her influence beyond her years, potentially threatening authority or upsetting social norms. Fringe legends claim that some elders used this threat to intimidate or guide villagers, though most likely, ordinary actions were misread. The air is filled with faint bird songs and the hum of insects, each detail reminding you that life went on despite suspicion. The older women who faced accusations often lived quietly, their senses attuned to subtle signs of mistrust, sideways glances, whispered comments, sudden avoidance. Humor hides in the absurdity. One record notes a woman accused simply because she knew too many remedies for neighbors' headaches, as if caring for others was inherently sinister. Historians still argue whether such cases were isolated or indicative of systemic fear. You notice the way light catches on your fingers as you rearrange dried herbs, recalling that knowledge of patterns, cycles, and natural remedies could appear almost magical to those uninitiated. Fringe folklore suggests that some older women were consulted secretly for advice, even as they were publicly condemned, acknowledgement shadowed by fear. The duality is striking, wisdom as a shield, wisdom as a target. As you rise, brushing off your skirt, you feel a subtle pride. To have lived, to have learned, to have nurtured knowledge and skill, these are human achievements. Yet, in the lens of medieval superstition, these very achievements could be construed as dangerous. The texture of wood, the smell of herbs, the whisper of wind in the trees, they all remind you that ordinary life carried extraordinary stakes, and so you walk slowly, each step measured, aware that centuries ago, living fully and wisely could place someone squarely in the crosshairs of communal fear. There's a strange comfort in imagining the courage it took, to persist, to care, to grow old, even when the world around you might misinterpret every action. Humor and resilience intertwine with caution, creating a delicate, almost meditative rhythm, connecting you to those who navigated life under suspicion centuries before. You move back into the cottage, brushing a strand of hair from your face, and your eyes land on the spinning wheel in the corner. A simple household tool, essential for weaving cloth and maintaining the home, but in the Middle Ages, even spinning could become incriminating. Spinning wheels and other domestic implements were sometimes interpreted as instruments of witchcraft, particularly when arranged or used in unusual patterns. Historians still argue whether these associations arose from genuine magical belief or were social constructs to police women's labor and autonomy. You run your fingers over the worn wood of the wheel, feeling the smooth grooves left by generations of hands. Fringe tales suggest that spinning in certain directions, clockwise or counterclockwise, could cast spells, protect against evil, or even summon storms. The ordinary act of weaving became an almost theatrical gesture in the eyes of the suspicious. You chuckle softly, imagining a neighbor accusing you of summoning a rainstorm simply because you twisted wool too vigorously. The sensory richness of your task is immediate, the coarse texture of raw wool against your palms, the faint scent of lanolin and old timber, the gentle creak of the wheel as it turns. Each motion is functional, yet every subtle variation could be interpreted as ritualistic. Some accounts even suggest that marks left on the floor by spinning wheels were read as occult symbols. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were widespread superstition or the embellishments of inquisitors' records. You begin to spin a few fibers, the motion smooth and hypnotic. The act feels meditative, but you can't shake the awareness of potential observation. Fringe stories claim that a skilled spinner could weave luck or misfortune into garments, affecting anyone who wore them. While obviously exaggerated, the anxiety these stories inspired is tangible. In a society obsessed with omens, mundane domesticity could be weaponized as proof of magic. Even the placement of the wheel mattered. A spinning wheel positioned in a corner, surrounded by herbs or symbols, might look like a ritual site to a cautious neighbor. You glance at the neat bundles of dried chamomile and sage hanging nearby, imagining how an outsider could misinterpret the arrangement. Historians still debate whether these readings were serious accusations or a convenient narrative device for legal proceedings. Your hands glide over the spindle, feeling the tension in the fibers, the faint resistance of the wool. The tactile detail is grounding, simple, familiar, human. Yet, centuries ago, someone spinning at odd hours, humming softly, or moving in unconventional patterns might face suspicion. Fringe folklore claims that spinning circles could summon spirits or attract demons, though in reality, most spinning was entirely mundane, necessary for warmth, clothing, and household function. You notice the faint scent of wax from the candle burning nearby, mingling with the herbs and the faint dust of wool. The combination of sensory input, the smell, the touch, the subtle creaking of wood, creates an atmosphere that could easily be read as eerie in dim light. A neighbor, peering through the window, might interpret these ordinary domestic details as evidence of supernatural intent. Historians still argue whether the anxiety over household tools reflected fear of magic, or a deeper social discomfort with women's independence and skill. A sense of humor surfaces again. Fringe records tell of spinners accused of bewitching the loom, supposedly causing thread to tangle for rivals or curses to descend on neighboring households. The absurdity is palpable. How could a misthreaded spool be evidence of devilish conspiracy? And yet, you realize, fear often feeds on the tiniest coincidence, magnifying ordinary errors into proof of malevolence. You resume spinning, feeling the steady rhythm, the tension of wool against wood, the gentle sway of the wheel. In this small, ordinary act lies a microcosm of medieval suspicion, the intersection of skill, routine, and misinterpretation. Every twist, pull, and turn of fiber is both practical and potentially incriminating, demonstrating how even simple domesticity could carry weighty consequences. As you step back, letting the spindle rest, you reflect on the paradox. The spinning wheel is both an object of survival and a symbol of fear. The scent of herbs, the texture of wool, the rhythm of motion, they all connect you to centuries of women whose ordinary work was scrutinized, misread, and sometimes condemned. And as you touch the smooth wooden wool once more, you appreciate the delicate balance they navigated, weaving cloth, tending home, and simultaneously weaving through layers of societal suspicion. You pause by the hearth, the warm glow casting flickering shadows on the walls, and instinctively adjust your clothing. Even today, you notice how certain colors pop in candlelight, deep reds, vivid blues, and rich blacks, and you can imagine how medieval villagers would read them. In the Middle Ages, clothing choices, particularly unusual fabrics or colors, could mark someone as suspicious. Wearing the wrong combination might suggest an alignment with mystical or forbidden powers. Historians still argue whether these accusations were tied to genuine fear of magic, or if they served as social tools to enforce conformity. You tug at the hem of your cloak, feeling the soft wool between your fingers. Fringe lore claims that bright colors could attract spirits or even enhance a spell's potency, while dull or muted tones could signify humility or invisibility to evil eyes. You smirk at the thought of your midnight blue cloak somehow indicting you, as if a fashion choice were equivalent to an oath to the devil. The absurdity is funny in retrospect, but in the 15th century, every hue carried weight, and every stitch could be scrutinized. The tactile sensations are vivid, the weave of your fabric, the slight itch of threads against your skin, the faint aroma of wool and candle smoke. Even a minor alteration, like folding a hem incorrectly or mixing colors considered unlucky, might spark whispers of witchcraft. Fringe tales suggest that some villagers claimed the wrong color pairing could curse a household or spoil crops. Historians still debate whether these observations were superstitious exaggerations or social policing of personal expression. You notice the subtle glint of embroidery along your sleeve, and for a moment imagine how an inquisitor might interpret the delicate patterns. Intricate designs, especially those resembling natural forms like spirals or stars, could be read as symbols of secret knowledge. In reality, they're just decorative, a product of skill and care, but perception was everything. Fringe accounts even suggest that certain stitching techniques were believed to trap spirits or channel energy. You chuckle softly, imagining your modest embroidery as a supernatural manifesto. Even your choice of accessories could invite scrutiny. A small brooch, a string of beads, or a feather tucked in your hat might be seen as a charm or talisman. The scent of your perfume, lavender, rosemary, or rosewater, could be interpreted as incense for magical rites. Historians still argue whether the association of clothing and witchcraft was widespread or mostly concentrated in specific regions and periods. You walk toward the window, feeling the soft fabric of your sleeve slide across your wrist, and reflect on how color, pattern, and adornment intersected with perception. Fringe tales recount cases where a young woman was accused simply for wearing a red sash, which was supposedly the mark of a witch's covenant. In contrast, a different village might have seen the same sash as an innocent display of fashion or status. The arbitrariness of judgment is striking. Yet it underscores the social pressures and fears of the time. The sensory environment is alive, the flicker of candlelight, the gentle warmth of the hearth, the soft brush of wool, and the faint scent of herbs drying above your head. Every detail reinforces how ordinary choices, color, texture, scent, could carry outsized significance. You adjust your cloak again, savoring the tactile reassurance, and realize that self-awareness was a necessary survival skill in an era dominated by communal suspicion. Humor creeps in, as always. Imagine being accused because your socks didn't match, or because your hat had a slightly curved feather, a detail that today seems trivial but might then have been interpreted as a secret magical code. The irony highlights how fear often relies on exaggeration, misinterpretation, and a dash of imagination. Historians still debate whether such petty accusations were common or just the colorful exceptions that survived in records. You settle by the hearth, feeling the soft warmth radiate through your body, and contemplate the paradox. Clothing, an expression of individuality, could also be a tool for accusation. The colors, textures, and adornments you choose, mundane in intent, were loaded with social and mystical meaning in another era. And as you trace the fabric of your cloak one last time, you feel connected to countless villagers who navigated life with a similar blend of care, creativity, and cautious awareness. The wind rattles gently against your window, carrying the faint scent of rain and earth, and you notice a small book lying on the table. Its leather cover is worn, the pages yellowed and brittle, and you flip it open to reveal handwritten notes and sketches of plants, animals, and curious symbols. In the Middle Ages, keeping a collection of knowledge, especially about nature, remedies, or celestial events, could be suspicious. Scholars were rare, and anyone with written records of unusual knowledge might be seen as dabbling in forbidden arts. Historians still argue whether these accusations targeted intellectual curiosity or were more about social control. You run your finger along the edges of the pages, feeling the texture of paper and ink, imagining a medieval neighbor peering through your window, eyes widening at the sight of your private collection. Fringe tales claim that such notebooks contained secret spells or diagrams of summoning circles, though in reality, most were practical notes, which herbs cured colic, or which flowers bloomed in each season. You chuckle at the idea of your botanical sketches being mistaken for diabolical schematics. The sensory experience of the book is grounding, the faint mustiness of old paper, the rough edges of torn pages, the tactile feedback of tracing ink lines. These ordinary sensations could be misread in a superstitious context. Fringe stories suggest that even the way you held a book, the angle at which it rested, or the order of sketches could signal magical intent. Historians still debate whether medieval fears about written knowledge were widespread or more common in isolated, particularly conservative, regions. You study a page detailing roots and leaves, noting careful observations of shape, color, and seasonality. Such attention to detail, while entirely scientific, could appear arcane. In a society sensitive to omens, a detailed drawing of a plant thought to have mystical properties could mark you as initiated. You smile wryly, thinking about modern gardeners accused of witchcraft simply for cataloging their tomatoes and herbs with enthusiasm. Even the mere act of writing could be incriminating. Quills scratching across parchment might be heard as muttered incantations by a wary listener. Fringe accounts claim that certain symbols or letters were thought to encode hidden knowledge or spells, though most of the time, the content was entirely mundane. Historians still argue whether the fear of literacy in women, particularly, contributed to these accusations. The tactile act of turning pages, the faint whisper of parchment, the smell of ink and old leather, all sensory cues combine to immerse you in a subtle tension. Every brush of the page could feel slightly illicit under medieval eyes. Fringe tales describe women being accused for writing down observations from nature or the stars, with the resulting notebooks confiscated as evidence of witchcraft. You shake your head in disbelief at the overreach, yet the pattern is clear. Knowledge itself could be dangerous. You notice a folded piece of paper tucked between two pages. Sliding it out, you see a simple list of remedies and observations, ink faded but legible. This small record, entirely practical, could have been interpreted as secret codes or instructions for spells. Humor creeps in at the absurdity. A perfectly innocent recipe for a healing salve becomes a blueprint for doom. Historians still argue whether the few sensationalized cases reflect general societal fear or selective documentation surviving in archives. The book reminds you of the broader pattern: observation, skill, and curiosity, so essential to human survival, were often double-edged swords. The sensory engagement of reading, the tactile pleasure of turning pages, and the intellectual satisfaction of observation were all acts that, in the wrong hands, could be construed as threats. Fringe legends even claim that books themselves were enchanted, capable of influencing readers' thoughts or summoning spirits, though clearly these were embellishments rather than reality. As the candle flickers and shadows dance across your walls, you reflect on the paradox. Knowledge, the act of seeing and recording, was both a tool of empowerment and a potential trap. You carefully close the book, feeling the worn leather under your fingertips, and sense a connection to countless women and men who preserved their observations, navigated fear, and survived under suspicion. The weight of ink, paper, and centuries of interpretation feels tangible, a reminder of how ordinary curiosity could be extraordinary and perilous in another age. You step outside again, feeling the cool evening air brush against your skin, and your attention is drawn to the small garden path lined with stones. In the Middle Ages, even the layout of stones, herbs, and fences could invite suspicion. Patterns, however mundane, were often read as deliberate designs for spells or protective circles. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were widespread or the product of occasional paranoid observers who saw magic in every corner. You kneel, brushing soil from a flat stone, and notice how naturally the moss has grown in the cracks. Fringe folklore claims that witches could harness the energy of stones, arranging them to channel power or attract spirits. You chuckle at the idea, your mossy stepping stones, placed purely for practicality and beauty, somehow serving as conduits for dark forces. The absurdity of suspicion never fails to amuse you, though you understand that in the 15th century, perception could outweigh reality. The tactile richness is immediate: cool stones under your fingertips, the rough texture of earth, and the faint scent of crushed leaves mixing with damp air. Even the simple act of walking along the path at certain times, dawn or dusk, could be read as ritualistic. Fringe stories recount villagers accusing healers and older women for walking in a particular rhythm along garden paths, interpreting each step as a mystical sign. Historians still debate whether these fears were rooted in genuine belief or social control over land and mobility. You glance at the arrangement of herbs nearby. Chamomile, sage, and lavender form natural clusters, yet an imaginative observer might construe them as part of an intentional magical circle. You run your fingers through the leaves, feeling their softness and the faint stickiness of early evening dew. Fringe tales suggest that herbs planted in circular patterns could ward off evil spirits, or summon them, depending on who told the story. You laugh quietly at the irony. An ordinary garden could be read as a stage for supernatural activity, even routine maintenance could attract attention. Pulling weeds, watering plants, or pruning herbs at night could be misread as ritual preparation. Historians still argue whether medieval communities genuinely feared these practices, or whether they were convenient excuses for targeting certain individuals, particularly women with knowledge or independence. Fringe accounts even suggest that footprints left in garden paths could be analyzed for magical intent, with certain shapes or placements considered evidence of incantations. You rise and dust your hands on your skirt, feeling the lingering dampness of the soil. The sensory environment, the scent of wet earth, the smooth texture of stones, the rustle of herbs, immerses you in ordinary life. Yet, centuries ago, the ordinary could transform into something extraordinary in the eyes of an anxious community. A misplaced stone, a bent twig, a curved garden path could all become evidence, if interpreted creatively. Humor creeps in again. Imagine being accused of witchcraft simply because your garden path curved in a way someone didn't like, or because your herbs grew in aesthetically pleasing clusters. Fringe stories recount cases where neighbors testified against women for having too neat or too patterned yards, an idea both ridiculous and terrifying. Historians still debate whether such cases were common or merely sensationalized examples preserved in court documents. You walk along the path slowly, feeling the stones underfoot, the gentle unevenness of the earth, and the brush of herbs against your hands. Each sensation reminds you that daily life, touch, smell, and rhythm, could be laden with social significance. The garden path, in all its simplicity, becomes a microcosm of medieval fear, ordinary acts scrutinized, patterns misread, and the mundane elevated to potential danger. As twilight deepens, you pause to listen to the wind in the trees and the distant clucking of chickens. The garden, with its stones, herbs, and subtle fragrances, embodies both comfort and risk. The tactile, aromatic, and visual details underscore the precariousness of life. Even tending a home and caring for the earth could make someone suspect. And yet, in that awareness lies a strange intimacy with the past, a connection to those who navigated fear with grace, humor, and quiet resilience. You crouch near the well at the edge of the yard, the wooden bucket cold and rough against your hands as you draw up water. In the Middle Ages, wells were not just sources of life, they were loci of suspicion. Drawing water at unusual hours, speaking to the well, or leaving objects near it could be interpreted as magical practice. Historians still argue whether these fears were rooted in practical concerns about contamination or in supernatural paranoia. You peer into the dark water, the ripples reflecting the moonlight. Fringe folklore claims that wells could serve as portals or mirrors to other worlds, revealing secrets or even inviting spirits. You laugh softly at the thought, a simple chore of fetching water being read as a mystical experiment. Yet you recognize the tension that ordinary tasks could create. A neighbor witnessing a lone figure at the well might see dark intent rather than daily routine. The sensory details are immediate: the cool splash of water, the rough wood under your palms, the faint smell of wet stone and earth. Each element could be laden with meaning. Fringe accounts describe objects placed near wells, coins, herbs, or tiny figurines, as protective charms or curses. Historians still debate whether these practices were widely understood as protective or if observers merely interpreted them as occult behavior. You refill the bucket and carry it back, feeling the water's weight and the smooth rope against your skin. Even the act of walking with purpose could attract suspicion. One tale recounts a woman accused of witchcraft for carrying water to her garden at dusk, supposedly because she was performing a ritual. You shake your head at the absurdity, recognizing a pattern. Ordinary life could easily be misconstrued when filtered through fear and imagination. The tactile sensation of the water sloshing against the wooden bucket contrasts with the faint chill in the air, the whisper of leaves, and the distant coo of a pigeon. Every small interaction with the environment could be scrutinized. Fringe stories suggest that some villagers believed that the reflection of the moon in water could reveal hidden intentions or amplify spells, making nighttime chores especially risky. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were localized beliefs or pervasive social norms. You set the bucket down, droplets splashing onto the stone, and feel a quiet satisfaction in completing a simple task. Yet, you can't help but imagine a medieval observer interpreting your actions as deliberate. Perhaps malevolent intent. The boundary between necessity and ritual was thin, and perception could shift dramatically depending on who was watching. Fringe accounts describe neighbors accusing women for the timing of their water drawing alone, convinced that dawn or dusk rituals carried mystical weight. Even the surrounding environment, the smell of damp earth, the faint metallic scent of iron tools, the soft murmur of water, could influence perception. The sensory richness of life, so comforting to you, might have been interpreted as ominous by those predisposed to fear. Humor slips in again, imagining someone accused because their shadow fell across the well in a suspicious way. Or because their reflection in the water seemed too knowing. Historians still debate how much superstition versus social control contributed to these accusations. You kneel once more, feeling the cold stone beneath your knees and listening to the gentle ripple of water. There is intimacy here, a closeness to the elements and a rhythm of daily life that transcends centuries. The well, ordinary yet central, embodies the precarious balance of survival, routine, and potential suspicion in medieval life. You notice the faint scent of herbs nearby, and suddenly, the entire courtyard, the garden, the hearth, the well, feels alive with both possibility and peril. As you stand, wiping your hands on your skirts, the sensory memory lingers: cold water, rough wood, night air, and faint moonlight. The mundane chore of drawing water has become a meditation on perception, superstition, and survival. Every sound, smell, and tactile sensation could be misread, yet these ordinary acts are what sustained life. And in this awareness, you feel a connection to those who lived centuries ago, negotiating fear, care, and community with quiet resilience, humor, and acute attention to the smallest details. You settle near the edge of the hearth, listening to the faint crackle of embers and the occasional pop of burning wood. In the Middle Ages, fire was both a source of warmth and a symbol fraught with suspicion. A hearth that burned too brightly, or smoke that spiraled in unusual patterns, could be interpreted as evidence of mystical practice. Historians still argue whether these interpretations arose from genuine fear of witchcraft or as a means to monitor domestic behavior, particularly among women. You reach for a small bundle of dried herbs hanging above the fire, sage, rosemary, and thyme, and the smell immediately fills the room. Fringe folklore claims that burning specific herbs could cleanse spaces of spirits or even attract them, depending on timing and technique. You smirk at the absurdity of ordinary fumigation turning into a ritual accusation. Yet centuries ago, a neighbor peering through a window could construe the aromatic haze as something far more sinister. The sensory experience is tangible: warmth against your skin, the rough texture of wooden beams beneath your fingertips, the faint smoke tingling your nose. Even the mundane act of tending the fire, stirring embers, adjusting logs, could be read as intentional, magical practice. Fringe tales describe villagers accusing women of summoning storms or illness merely by manipulating hearth flames. Historians still debate how frequently such claims were serious versus performative accusations to enforce social norms. You fan the embers lightly, observing the glow and the movement of smoke. Shadows dance across walls, elongating and twisting in ways that could appear supernatural. Ordinary domesticity, stoking a fire, drying herbs, boiling water, intersects with perception, producing an atmosphere easily misread. Fringe accounts tell of neighbors testifying that the color or trajectory of smoke indicated spells being cast, though in reality, smoke was just smoke. Even the arrangement of objects near the hearth could carry weight. A kettle placed at a precise angle, a broom leaned against a particular wall, or a pile of herbs in a specific formation might be interpreted as ritualistic. You brush a hand across the rough wooden mantle, imagining the eyes of cautious neighbors, scrutinizing for evidence of hidden practices. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were isolated incidents or part of broader societal surveillance of women's spaces. You notice the subtle scent of soot mixed with dried leaves, grounding you in the physical reality of the hearth. Fringe stories insist that the smell itself could signal witchcraft, alerting neighbors or spirits to the presence of the practitioner. The idea seems ludicrous now, yet in a period attuned to omens, every sensory input, from smell to sound to movement, was potentially meaningful. Humor surfaces in your imagination: a woman accused of casting spells because her fire crackled unusually, or smoke from a burnt supper misinterpreted as a sinister omen. The thin line between necessity and accusation highlights how ordinary domestic acts were fraught with peril. Historians still debate whether these accusations were strategic social tools or genuine superstition. You stoke the fire gently, feeling the warm air curl around your hands and face. The tactile and olfactory sensations, the rough wood, the faintly acrid smoke, the comforting heat, create a layered experience, blending comfort with a subtle tension. Fringe legends tell of fires that could reveal the moral character of a household, the purity of its occupants, or even their alignment with hidden powers. You shake your head with a quiet laugh. In reality, it's just warmth and survival. As you step back, letting the fire glow softly, you reflect on the paradox of domestic life. Ordinary routines, feeding a fire, drying herbs, boiling water, were both sustaining and potentially incriminating. Every sensory detail could be misinterpreted, yet these acts were essential to daily existence. And in that flickering light, you sense the intricate balance medieval people maintained: survival intertwined with fear, caution laced with humor, and ordinary action shadowed by extraordinary suspicion. You step into the small attic, the air cooler here, carrying a faint musty scent of old wood and forgotten textiles. In the Middle Ages, storing objects that were old, strange, or out of place could be enough to draw suspicion. Hidden tools, mysterious trinkets, or even personal belongings tucked away might be read as evidence of secret practices. Historians still argue whether these fears were rooted in superstition, or if they were methods of controlling space and property. Particularly for women, you run your fingers along a dusty chest, feeling the rough grain of its lid. Fringe folklore claims that objects kept out of sight could accumulate energy, which a witch might later harness. You chuckle softly at the thought: your attic clutter, once a practical storage solution, transformed into an arsenal of magical potential in the eyes of medieval imagination. Even seemingly trivial possessions, a jar, a feather, a scrap of fabric, could be scrutinized for hidden meaning, the sensory detail of the attic is vivid, the creak of floorboards underfoot, the dust tickling your nose, the cool touch of aged wood. Each element could be misread. Fringe tales suggest that old objects, especially those with personal significance, might be charged with intention or spellcraft, giving rise to suspicion without any overt act. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were widespread or largely confined to storytelling and court records. You lift an old bundle of herbs, inhaling the faint scent of dried lavender and rosemary. In medieval belief, such storage could be interpreted as preparation for rituals, protective charms, or even curses. Yet in practice, it was simply an efficient way to preserve ingredients through winter. You grin at the irony, survival skill mistaken for clandestine magic. Even the organization of the attic, bundles stacked neatly, tools hanging in order, fabrics folded precisely, could be misinterpreted. Fringe accounts describe villagers accusing women of laying out their implements to summon spirits or manipulate fortune. Historians still argue whether these readings were genuinely feared, or more about enforcing social hierarchies and suspicion toward independent women. The tactile engagement continues, your fingertips brush rough cloth, smooth wood, and brittle paper. The faint scent of dust, herbs, and aged timber mingles in your senses. In the medieval mind, every detail, placement, material, and pattern could be imbued with intention. Fringe legends assert that even arranging objects by size or color might indicate secret knowledge or magical practice. You shake your head with amusement, your practical organization has now become a hypothetical ritual. Humor slips in again. Imagine being accused because your attic was tidy, your herbs arranged just so, or your textiles folded neatly. The line between practicality and suspicion is absurdly thin, highlighting how ordinary behavior could be weaponized by perception alone. Historians still debate whether accusations of this type were exceptions or indicative of systemic mistrust. You pause at a small window, peering out as the evening darkens, letting the cool breeze brush your face. The tactile contrast, the warmth of the chest lid, the roughness of wood, the faint chill in the air, grounds you. Fringe accounts describe attics as places of clandestine activity, where secret arts could be performed unseen. Yet, most attic work in reality was mundane, storing essentials, mending clothes, or preserving herbs. As you straighten, surveying your little domain, the attic transforms in your imagination into a microcosm of medieval fear and pragmatism. Every item, every surface, every scent carries potential meaning, yet is fundamentally ordinary. The delicate balance between survival, routine, and interpretation echoes throughout history, reminding you of the precarious interplay between human action and societal perception. And in that quiet space, you feel a gentle kinship with those who navigated suspicion, care, and domestic responsibility with wry humor, acute observation, and quiet resilience. You descend the narrow stairs, the final creak of wood announcing your cautious movement, and step into the moonlit yard. Tonight, the garden, the hearth, the spinning wheel, the attic, and even the simple path are all stitched together in your mind as a network of ordinary acts shadowed by extraordinary perception. In the Middle Ages, living in a small village meant that every action, fetching water, arranging herbs, tending fires, could be scrutinized. Historians still argue whether these observations were genuinely feared or manipulated to maintain social control over individuals, particularly women. You walk slowly along the familiar path, brushing past soft herbs and mossy stones. Fringe folklore suggests that the alignment of all these mundane acts could accumulate a sort of latent magic, detectable only by keen-eyed observers or, of course, suspicious neighbors. You chuckle quietly, thinking how the ordinary rhythm of daily life could transform into a labyrinth of imagined intentions and potential accusations. The sensory richness surrounds you, the cool night air, the rough texture of the stone path beneath your feet, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, and the subtle fragrance of herbs mingling with the earth. In a society attuned to signs, every sound, scent, and tactile sensation could be imbued with meaning. Fringe stories describe people accused of witchcraft simply for walking barefoot in the dew or leaving footprints along garden paths. Historians still debate whether such cases were isolated or emblematic of broader societal paranoia. You pause by the well, dipping a finger into the cool water, feeling the weight and resistance. Ordinary, practical acts like this, fetching water, tending the fire, cataloging herbs, were sometimes misread as deliberate magical practice. You notice the reflection of moonlight on the surface, imagining how it might have been interpreted as a conduit to other worlds. Fringe lore claims that wells were portals or mirrors, revealing secrets, summoning spirits, or amplifying intention. You smile wryly, your casual gesture, a centuries-old daily necessity, becomes charged with imaginary potency. Even the act of walking, turning, or touching objects carried meaning. You feel the rough edges of the wooden fence. The warmth of the hearth lingering on your skin, the soft texture of wool from your spinning projects. Each sensory detail could be misinterpreted, amplified into a narrative of supernatural engagement. Historians still argue whether these fears were largely symbolic, instructive, or genuinely believed by communities. Humor weaves through your reflection. Imagine being accused because your reflection in the well looked too knowing, or because your herbs grew in aesthetically pleasing patterns. The absurdity is striking, yet it underscores the precarious balance medieval people maintained. Everyday acts were essential for survival, yet subject to constant scrutiny. Fringe stories insist that even laughter, humming, or quiet singing could be signs of secret ritual, though clearly, most actions were innocent. You stroll past the spinning wheel and the herb bundles, feeling the cool night air brush your face. Ordinary tools, ordinary gestures, ordinary smells and textures, they all intersect with imagination, suspicion, and interpretation. The tapestry of daily life, from drawing water to tending the hearth, spins a story of human vigilance, resilience, and humor. And as you look back over the courtyard, you recognize that centuries of fear and observation were intertwined with survival, learning, and community. Finally, you settle on a low bench, feeling the smooth wood beneath your hands, the soft night air brushing your cheeks, and the faint scent of herbs and earth mingling in the darkness. You inhale slowly, allowing the textures, smells, and sounds to imprint themselves. This is life under scrutiny, yet life lived fully. A rhythm of ordinary actions shadowed by extraordinary imagination, a quiet balance maintained with humor, skill, and attention to detail. You lean back, letting your body sink into the bench, and the night stretches around you. Vast and calm. The garden, the house, the spinning wheel, the well, the attic, they all fade into the background of your mind, becoming gentle impressions rather than points of tension. The air carries the soft whispers of leaves and the faint fragrance of dried herbs, blending into a lullaby of ordinary life. It's quiet, ordinary, and safe, and you allow yourself to notice the subtle rhythms of the world, the way the wind bends a branch, the faint rustle of a cat padding softly across the stone, the distant murmur of village life settling into sleep. In this slow, meditative pace, you realize that most fears were imagined, most threats were circumstantial, and most suspicion was a product of perspective. The same herbs that once could have marked someone as a witch now simply perfume the air. The worn wooden tools, the scattered stones, the creaking floorboards, all ordinary, all grounding. You feel the tension of centuries ease away with every breath, replaced by gentle curiosity, quiet amusement, and a sense of connection to those who lived, laughed, and labored under far more watchful eyes. The night air cools your skin, the faint scents linger, and your senses absorb the ordinary magic of existence, texture, aroma, temperature, light, and sound combining into a peaceful whole. You breathe deeply, letting each detail settle into memory, recognizing both the fragility and resilience of human life. Humor and wisdom intertwine, and you carry a gentle appreciation for the delicate balance of survival and imagination, caution and curiosity. Now, as the final shadows stretch long and the world exhales into sleep, you feel a quiet smile forming. The Middle Ages, once a land of suspicion and misinterpretation, transforms in your mind into a tapestry of ordinary people navigating complexity with ingenuity, care, and humor. Your eyes grow heavy, your muscles relax, and the soft cadence of night lulls you further into calm.